Let me share my slides, and I will always keep the chat open. So please ask any questions. You can put comments in there. I want this to be a dynamic session. I know we have question and answers at the end of the session, but you can stop me and we can kind of have a dialogue. I would love to see your faces, if possible. If possible, I would love to. If you can keep your video on, that'll be fantastic. Okay, so can you all see my slides? Yeah, can you hear me well? Is the volume okay? All right. So very briefly, Babson is a 100-year-old school. For 27 years, we have been ranked #1 in entrepreneurship. Nearly 20% of our students go start their own companies, and nearly 40% of our students come from family businesses, and they are usually the future CEOs and presidents of their family businesses. So the focus of Babson is to train CEOs, whether they are founding CEOs of companies, whether they are not-for-profit CEOs, or for that matter, large companies. The current CEO of Toyota is a Babson alumni, CEO of Bancolombia, CEO of PwC. These are all people of very large companies. So today we're going to talk about crises and how we humans become very creative during crises. Specifically, I'm going to introduce a term called application innovation. And how is that linked to creativity? And what is that? We all have the innovator's DNA. We are all born entrepreneurial. We are all born creative. We are all creative in different ways. So we need to understand how we can tap into those kinds of creative juices that are within us. If you look at some examples from the past, when the World War II ended, Boeing, all its business was only towards the war, the Department of Defense. And overnight, when the war ended, 90% of its revenues were gone. But at that moment in time, they made a decision and they launched the biggest project ever. And that was the Boeing 707. And that actually was the dawn of the jet age. And it completely changed air travel. If you look at an entire country, and when the Soviet Union fell, Cuban exports just collapsed. And at that moment in time, again, they had to dig deep and actually compromise their own values. They actually threw open their beaches for private development. So in times of crises, you may have to actually revisit your deep beliefs, and you may have to actually change your mindset. A smaller scale, much closer to your place. This is during the Asian economic crisis. Brahmangrad Hospital had spent a lot of money upgrading to international standards, but it was mostly catering to the upper middle class Thais. But during the crisis, they had a huge problem of revenue. What they did at that moment is turn the entire hospital towards medical tourism. Today, Brahmangrad, actually 500,000 people globally come for medical treatment to this hospital. It became ground zero for medical tourism. Now at a very smaller scale, this is a very high-end restaurant in Medellin, Colombia. And it was all contemporary food and Latin fusion Asian food. But of course, when the pandemic hit, all the customers were gone. But overnight, Carmen transformed the entire restaurant to serve comfort food, because people were now wanting to be at home and eating comfort food. So they were actually doing pizzas. They were doing what they call arroz con pollo, chicken rice, okay, and ice cream. So they completely changed the menu, and within 2 weeks, they had 2-hour waiting time for deliveries. So what we see actually in this pandemic, I'm sure you have noticed that there is creativity and innovation all around us. And there are many, many examples, whether it is Dyson, which is a UK company who created a ventilator in 10 days, NASA using some of their resources. How do you get to respond to this? Or for that matter, Google and Apple teaming up, even though they are fierce rivals. So we have many, many stories, and I'm sure in your own companies you have such stories because of this shock that we have had. A hospital in Cincinnati, they used to do 2,000 telehealth visits in a year, but post-COVID, they were doing 5,000 per week. In Dubai, 1,000 employees were completely retrained to do a completely different task. Best Buy is the largest electronic retail company in the United States, and they were testing before the pandemic a few curbside pickup. But after the pandemic, they rolled it out to 1,000 stores all over the United States in 2 days. And of course, these type of stories are all over the world. So what is it that happens to us when there is a crisis? We have seen this even before the crisis. Okay. In the US, before the pandemic, physical retail stores were just dying. The maximum number of bankruptcies happened in a 3-year period, 2016 to 2019. The list goes on and on and on. Some of the biggest chains went bankrupt. But at the same time, we were seeing lots of innovative new business models in physical retail, lots of different new opportunities in physical retail. And so while there were bankruptcies going on, there was new birth, new innovative business models coming up. So many of you who know Chinese, we understand the word crisis. Crisis comes from Greek. And the word actually means it's a time of decision making. And of course, in Chinese, the word is weiji. Weiji means crisis in Mandarin, and at the same time, it means opportunity. So we see that creativity and innovation goes hand in hand during crises. So in the United States, the number of new businesses being created has been very stable. I'm showing you data only for about 10 years, but for 30 years, this data is very stable. But during this pandemic, the number of new businesses has exploded. Not all of them are going to survive. Most of them will die. But what we are seeing is that explosion in creativity. So let's understand. Let's understand how we humans become creative. What leads us to become creative? So let's take some of the most creative minds of our times. It's also related to innovation. There are many, many, many ways to innovate. There is no one or two ways to innovate. Product innovation, process innovation, marketing innovation, customer experience innovation, business model innovation. And also, innovation is very democratic. Small companies like Palm can innovate. Small companies like Motorola, but at the same time, large companies like Samsung and Nokia, anybody can innovate. It's nothing to do with resources. So innovation is very democratic in that sense. Let's just pick one thing called application innovation. What is this application innovation? Application innovation is taking something that works in one industry and moving it to a different industry. We have had batteries, lithium-ion batteries here in our cell phones. What did Tesla do? Elon Musk took thousands and thousands of these same batteries and packaged it into one box and put it under the car. That's application innovation. We have had GPS in aircraft ever since satellites have been up in space. But only now we have our GPS on our wrist, on our hands. And so when you move things from one industry to a different industry, that's the maximum amount of innovation that happens. Among all the types of innovation, application innovation is the most common form of innovation. And that is related to creativity. An example, Southwest Airlines in the US is one of the most famous airlines. It's today the #4 airline in the United States in terms of volume. But they were born in a crisis. They were born during a time of regulation. And there was a lawsuit. And they did not wait for the lawsuit to be settled. What they did was they went to another company called Pacific Southwest Airlines. And they took their owner manual, they took their training manuals and started training them. Southwest Airlines is known as the king or the queen of low-cost airlines, whether it is EasyJet in Europe or Ryanair in Europe or even Indigo in India. The model has always been Southwest Airlines. They always try to copy Southwest Airlines. But Southwest itself was copied from another company called Pacific Southwest Airlines. So the founder basically said, we don't mind being copycats. We copied Pacific Southwest so completely that you can call us a photocopy. So they just dropped the word Pacific and became Southwest Airlines. 4 years later, during the oil embargo, they were going bankrupt. And the CEO basically said, the CFO said, we have only 4 planes. In order to survive, we need to sell one of the planes. But then they said, we don't want to reduce the number of passengers we are carrying. We want to carry the same number of passengers per day, but with one less plane. So the idea was to minimize the amount of time in the airport. So they come to the gate, they get the people out, get the baggage out, put the people in, put the baggage in, fuel the plane, clean the plane, out in 20 minutes. If you need to do this, who are you going to go and learn this from? It's a question. Why don't you guess on the chat? Who will you learn this from if you want to very quickly turn the plane at the gate? What do you think? Is the question clear? Formula One, Freddie, absolutely. It was Formula One. Today, many hospitals, they go to Formula One because they want to improve the emergency room operations. As soon as somebody comes, a victim comes from an accident, they need to learn how to kind of immediately resuscitate the person and stabilize the person. So they're learning that from Formula One. Henry Ford, the assembly line of Henry Ford. Where do you think he got his idea from? What would you guess? Did he wake up one morning in the bathtub and ran to the city center saying, Eureka? What do you think? What are your guesses? From Newton? Ready? Oh, come on. You can guess. There's nothing wrong in guessing. Okay, from the slaughterhouse. He was visiting a slaughterhouse. And then he saw all the animals on the conveyor. And he said, oh my God, I can do this for the cars. Google PageRank was copied from the Academic Citation Index. The magic wristband at Disney was copied from the Nike Fuel Band. And the Genius Bar at Apple was copied from a concierge desk at a 5-star hotel. I'm sure it's very different in Southeast Asia, but at least in the West, what do you think? What do you think is the most famous love story? You're all very quiet for marketing people. Come on. Of course, Romeo and Juliet. It was copied. It was not an original. What were his other famous tragedies? Hamlet was copied. Macbeth was copied. King Lear was copied. Merchant of Venice was copied. Othello was copied. Many of these were totally copied from other pieces. Bob Dylan, his first 25 songs, none of them were original. So if you want to get a Nobel Prize, what do you need to do? So Walt Disney, his first 10 movies, none of them were original. When he wanted to create the Disneyland, he took a team of people to Tivoli Gardens in Denmark, took out a sheet of paper, copied the layout, went back to Anaheim in California and created Disneyland. Picasso, he was notorious for copying. When he moved from Spain to Paris, the other artists were scared to allow him to come into their studios because they were afraid that he would copy everything. Now, you have to guess this. Be brave. You don't have to be politically correct. You have to guess at least one country name. Who do you think which country is this? This was the United States 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Because the famous English author, Charles Dickens, he came to Boston in 1842 for the first time. He had never been to the New World. When he lands in Boston, he's very upset. He's very angry because all his books are being sold on the streets of Boston without any copyrights. And at that time, Boston, northeast of the US, was the textile capital of the New World. And all the machinery in the textile mills, everything stolen without patents and copyrights. So he goes back to England and he writes an article in the newspaper. I will never step foot in this country of thieves. This was Japan after World War II. This was Korea and Taiwan in the 1980s. In the 1980s, I used to come to Singapore often. And at that time, Singapore was obsessed with copying another city. Whatever that city did, Singapore had to have it. They would copy immediately. Do you want to guess which city they were copying all the time? In everything that they did?
Yeah.
They were copying Hong Kong. Whatever Hong Kong did, Singapore had to have it. And in the year 2000, I went to Dubai. And who was Dubai trying to copy in the year 2000? Copying Singapore. And Emirates was obsessed with copying Singapore Airlines. And then I went to Doha. Doha wanted to copy Dubai. Then I went to Kuwait a few years ago. They were copying Dubai. So this is what happens. Today, Facebook is copying WeChat. Amazon is copying Alibaba. Everybody is copying TikTok. There is nobody who is not copying TikTok. Steve Jobs has said many, many times how he copied from some of the best ideas around the world, especially the Alto computer from Xerox PARC. I'm not saying originality is not important. I'm not saying patents are not important. I'm not saying uniqueness is not important. You should always try to aim for the originality, but the starting point is copying. The more you copy, the more creative you become. The faster you copy, the more creative you become. The more you copy, you will find your uniqueness. You will find your originality. The very famous Mexican painter, Frida Kahlo, a surrealist painter. She never had any formal training. She never went to art school. And her parents realized that she was very talented. So at the age of 13, they decide to bring a tutor, a teacher, to help her with her art and painting. And the teacher looks at all the work she has done, and he says, for a young person, you're very talented, you're very creative. But then he says, stop being original. Copy the masters. You will become even more creative. So during the pandemic, one of the first things that I started to notice when this epidemic started spreading in China, this is February 25, 2020, employee sharing is emerging as a trend during the COVID pandemic. A few small restaurants had come together and said, we don't want to lay off our employees. We don't want to fire them. So they were pooling their employees and lending them to large companies who are having a lot of need for deliveries, of online deliveries. So then what happened was the big gorillas, the big large companies also jumped in and started doing exactly the same thing. And so they were copying the smaller companies. When I came to India at that time, India had also started doing exactly the same thing based on what was happening in China. So if you go back to the Spanish flu of 1918 and compare two cities, the deaths in Philadelphia was much, much bigger than St. Louis. And the public health director at Philadelphia had ignored all the experts, had ignored all the precautions, and was throwing a big party in the city. Whereas in St. Louis, it was a completely different story. Dr. Max Starkloff, who was the health commissioner, he knew the problems of the pandemic. And immediately he put together the group of very diverse people from very different walks of the community and brought together the community to make sure that they're going to keep the pandemic out of the city. Even if they cannot keep the pandemic out of the city, they wanted to keep the deaths to a minimum. And so where did he get this idea? How did he know what to do the right thing? That's because he had seen his father do this. His father was a doctor who was sent to Germany as the US consul in Bremen. And that was the time when there was a cholera epidemic in Germany. And he had seen his father trying to stop people from getting on the boats going into the US. He knew all the things that his father had done. And so what he did was copy what his father had done many years before. So for us, to become creative, copying is the starting point. And we have research called the innovator's DNA. What does this research tell us? The research tells us that scientists, inventors, innovators, entrepreneurs, especially serial entrepreneurs who create lots of different companies, they have certain skills, mindset, and behaviors. What are these skills, mindset, and behaviors? Number one is questioning the status quo. Number two, observing and listening without bias, without prejudice. And number three is networking amongst diverse thinkers, exposing yourself to a variety of different thinking. And when you do a lot of these things, comes associative thinking. What is associative thinking? Associative thinking is connecting the dots. And once they kind of do associative thinking, they experiment to see if they can make it work. Now, the word associative thinking is a fancy way of saying copying and stealing. So academics and consultants have big words. We can't write books or publish journals, but I just say, please copy and steal legally. If you want to become very, very creative, please steal and copy legally. So in the COVID-19, there is an entire website. I do a lot of work with retail businesses and airline companies. You can go to this website and you can copy lots and lots and lots of ideas in a variety of different industries, in all these industries. So I have been pushing all my entrepreneurs and executives to go to this website and how can you borrow ideas very quickly to solve problems during the pandemic, whether it is airline companies, whether it's retail companies, it doesn't matter. So let me stop here and then we will have a discussion. Okay, let me stop the sharing.